to start with a short exercise. So, if you will, join me. Take a deep breath, pause, close your eyes if you prefer. I want you to think about what image comes into your mind when I say the phrase, the war on drugs. Now, for me, lots of images come to mind. I think of police drug busts and seizures on the nightly news, sniffer dogs at music festivals and on city streets. I think of arrests and mass incarceration. I think of the notorious drug lord Pablo Escobar. Perhaps, like me, you also had TV shows and films come to mind, because across my lifetime I've watched so many in which the war on drugs plays a really central role. So maybe if you're older like me, you thought of Miami Vice, or perhaps Narcos, Breaking Bad, or The Wire. But whatever image it was that came to your mind, I'm hoping that by the end of today's talk, I'll be able to put a different image in your mind. I'm hoping that in future, when you hear that phrase, the war on drugs, you'll think of this frog. Bear with me. Now, this is the savannah tree frog, and it's a tiny, vulnerable, delicate little frog that lives high up in the mountains of Colombia. And this is a frog whose life and future is actually bound up with the war on drugs. And I want to tell you about why. Now, I'm a sociologist and a lawyer, but don't hold that against me. I'm also a drug policy researcher, and I have worked in this field for 15 years. Drug policy and drug law are complex, controversial, and very sensitive fields. But there's one thing that I can tell you for sure, one thing I can tell you with confidence, and that is that the war on drugs, our dominant legal and policy approach in which we criminalise the manufacture and use and supply of drugs, has been a catastrophic policy failure. And I get that you might be sceptical about that idea. But let me ask you if this sounds like a resounding policy success story to you. Let me give you one example of what happens as a consequence of our approach. In the last few years, so many people have died of drug overdoses in countries like the United States and Canada that the overall life expectancy of the entire population has actually declined. And that's the kind of thing that usually only happens in times of great war or plague. It happens because of how we regulate drugs, or don't regulate drugs. We prohibit use, manufacture and supply, and this drives the manufacture of drugs underground. We have no regulatory oversight, and people who use drugs can never be guaranteed of a safe supply. Let me tell you another thing about the relationship between our approach to drugs and death. About half of all executions in the world every year are for drug offences. And there's some irony here, because the use of the death penalty for drug offences is actually illegal under international law. So we break the law in order to enforce the law. We deliberately kill people in a bid to save lives, and these measures just do not work. Now, I get what you might be thinking at this point. I'm going to have a guess. Perhaps you're thinking, well, Kate, drugs are dangerous. The drug trade is harmful. People who use drugs bring these harms upon themselves. Perhaps you're thinking, I don't use drugs, I don't know people who use drugs, why should I be motivated to care? Well, in Australia, about 50% of people have used an illicit drug in their lifetime. About 1 in 5 Australians have used an illicit drug in the last 12 months. So, statistically speaking, every second person in this room has used an illicit drug in their lifetime. You may think that you don't know someone who uses drugs, but actually You do, you will, you perhaps just don't realise it yet. And in this sense, the war on drugs affects people that we care about. It affects all of us. Now, I want to go back in time a little bit and say a few words about that phrase, the war on drugs, and where it comes from. It was first used right back in 1971 by the then American President Richard Nixon. Nixon was worried about increasing rates of drug use in the United States, and he declared drugs as public enemy number one. He also declared a war on drugs, and he argued that extraordinary measures, warlike powers, were needed so that governments could combat it. Now, some decades later, one of Nixon's top aides came out and made a public confession. That aide said, actually, Nixon wasn't really concerned about drugs at all. He was concerned about two groups that he saw as political threats to him. These were black communities on the one hand and people who were protesting against the Vietnam War on the other. Nixon essentially wanted an excuse to mobilise police power to target them. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? The aide said. Of course we did. That's a literal quote. And so the war on drugs has never really been about substances, or not only about substances at all. It's always been about the targeting of particular communities. These are communities that we should care about, and over time, the war on drugs, the war on particular communities, has become a war on the planet. Now, in order to understand why, I want you to come on a journey with me to Colombia. As some of you might know, Colombia is the world's #1 producer of the drug cocaine. It has been home to a long-standing armed conflict because of the presence of cartels like the one run by Pablo Escobar, who I mentioned earlier. And the war on drugs, the drug trade in that region, has really had a profound effect on communities there. But let me tell you something else about Colombia that you may not know. It is also home to the world's second largest number of frog species. Many beautiful and unique species of frogs can be found in the country, and about half of those species of frog are now actually critically endangered. One of the species of frogs that experts are increasingly concerned about is the savannah tree frog. Now, as I mentioned to you, it lives high up in the mountains of Colombia, in the rich, diverse ecosystem of the Amazon basin. It shares its home with many other beautiful animals and birds, and it also shares its home with the coca plant, a plant that grows naturally there and which is used as the basis of the drug cocaine. Now, in the early 1990s, the Colombian government was concerned about the drug trade, and it decided to launch its own war on drugs. It was backed by the United States of America, and what the Colombian government decided to do was take to the air. In small planes, the Colombian government decided to spray a weed-killing chemical known as glyphosate across these vast areas of forest, right into the Amazon basin. And their aim was simple. They wanted to eradicate the coca plant and destroy the production of cocaine. The result, as you might guess, was a catastrophe. People who lived in the area began to complain of health effects, skin conditions, illness, miscarriage, and more. Experts reported concerns about the impacts on soil and wildlife, riverways, lakes, and ponds, the very habitats, in other words, that frogs live in and rely on. And this includes the savannah tree frog. Now, Indigenous people in the community in particular protested and called for a stop to the spraying, but the Colombian government ignored those concerns for 20 years. And it wasn't until 2015 that something changed. In fact, two things happened. First, the World Health Organization declared that that chemical they were spraying was probably carcinogenic, that is, cancer-causing, to humans. And second, a Colombian court ordered an immediate stop to the spraying. Now, by that time, nearly 4 million acres of land had been sprayed. And that is a truly enormous area, one that might be difficult to wrap your head around. So let me try and put it into perspective for you. 4 million acres of land is the equivalent of 64 million tennis courts, or 3 million American football fields. It's the size of a country like Belgium. Now imagine spraying a weed-killing chemical into an area that vast, that rich, that diverse, teeming with life, in the hope that you will be able to pinpoint and eradicate just one particular plant that you want to destroy. A plant, mind you, that has grown there for thousands of years, a plant that is quite ancient, like many species of frog. Now, I want to be clear that Colombia is not the only country in the world to have resorted to some pretty extreme measures as part of its war on drugs. And sometimes these sorts of eradication measures work, or they appear to work, in the sense that often the production of drugs, whether it's cocaine or cannabis or heroin from the opium poppy or other drugs that we extract from fungi, appear to slow down. Or production moves to a neighbouring country. But often production just pops up quickly. It pops up again soon enough. And that's because our approach to prohibiting drug use, drug manufacture and supply drives drug use underground. It enables cartels. It makes drugs very lucrative in an entirely unregulated market. And remember, demand for drugs doesn't go away because every second person in this room has used an illicit drug in their lifetime. So, I think we urgently need to change course, but I also think we lack the political courage in order to do it. And I think in part we have been thinking about the problem in the wrong way. So the main international drug treaty tells us that drugs are a danger to mankind, and I think that is telling. Drugs are a danger to us. Perhaps we are also a danger. Legal experts like me have increasingly been asking us to think more critically about how we design laws, how we design policies, and how we implement practices. They have been asking us not to think about ourselves as the centre of the universe, not to design laws and policies and practices as if we are the only ones that matter, because, spoiler alert, we are not. We live in interrelation. So where do we go from here? Well, I think we need to do 3 things. First, we need to admit and accept that the war on drugs, that our approach of prohibition is a policy failure. Second, we need to move towards a legal system in which all of these issues are taken into account. And third, we need to invest much more heavily in harm reduction measures. That means supervised injecting rooms, needle and syringe programs, methadone maintenance treatment, heroin-assisted therapy for those who want it, and the testing and regulation of the drug supply so that it is safe. And that last idea, I understand, might sound radical to some of you, but we already do this for the most popular drug of all, alcohol. Now, in Australia, we have some of these measures in place, but we don't do anywhere near enough of them. We spend billions of dollars every year on drug countermeasures, but less than 2% of that is invested in harm reduction measures of the kind I mentioned. And these are the measures that are proven time and again to save lives. Less than 2%. Now, as I stand here in November 2025, the Colombian government is under renewed pressure to recommence its aerial fumigation campaign. And that pressure, once again, is coming from the United States of America. They should know better than anyone that such measures will be ineffective, but they are not without effects. They have effects. Those effects will flow quite literally into soil and rivers and lakes and ponds, into the habitats of the savannah tree frog. And so, as I said earlier, I want to see us change course. I want to see us garner the political courage to do something different. And you have a role to play in that. In future, when you hear someone use that phrase, the war on drugs, I'm hoping that some different image will come to mind. I'm hoping you'll think of this frog. I'm hoping you'll think of the interconnections between law and policy and planetary health and the need to do something different. I'm hoping you'll remember that the war on drugs is a war on communities, a war on ecosystems, a war on frogs, one that matters to us all. I'd like to see us change course because the war on drugs is a failure, and it is time, once and for all, that we end it.